Maybe a shift of gears from demographics to regulation, Bob.
So sort of the sublime to the ridiculous is what you're suggesting. Well, let me set the stage for some further discussion. Of course, I bring a U.S. point of view. That's my purpose here today. And I always get asked when I visit, gee, Washington seems to be a little less than efficient and functional these days, and I can confirm that Washington is largely institutionally dysfunctional right now, simply because of the reality that we have an administration in Washington, that's and a split Congress. We've got a Democratic Senate and a Republican House. It's not likely that in the coming short term there will be any legislation. Where things are effective and where they're functioning to the point where we should all take notice is through the regulators. The regulators have, in the current environment, been quite aggressive in law enforcement. They have had significant increases in not only the number of situations they've resolved, and this could be the Justice Department, it could be virtually any of the regulatory agencies at the national level. But on the other end of those cases have been our clients and other corporations in the states and even beyond, because the reach of some of these rules goes outside the U.S. to some degree. So let me give you an example. Corruption. So no one wants or embraces corruption. There's a number of anti-corruption initiatives, starting, I would note, with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that the states passed in the late 70s, and then reinforced by Sarbanes-Oxley, where public companies put in, codes of conduct, codes of ethics, hotlines, various mechanisms to monitor things in the company that might create a problem with the old FCPA or Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But in recent times, the UK Bribery Act, Brazil, and many other countries are sort of on the corruption bandwagon, if you will. And what we've seen coming out of D.C. is increasing number of cases with increasing financial consequences. So let me give you an example. In the last 5 years, if you look at the corporate corruption type settlements, the average has been $80 million per occurrence for a 5-year period ending last year. If you go the 5 years before that, it was less than 20 million. So there's sort of a quadrupling impact, financial impact. And so what we're seeing with our clients is, yes, we have a code of conduct. Yes, it covers the entire span of behavior that needs to be monitored, but they're finding it worth their while to put a separate parallel program in for anti-corruption, focusing it in those markets and those places where it becomes much more cultural, much more difficult to simply shut down 100%. And the thought process is, if there's a problem, they're going to get, frankly, some extra credit from the regulators for anticipating the importance of anti-corruption activities and efforts. And that's just one example, but the numbers are compelling to the point where people are thinking, and maybe there's a different and better way. I also want to talk a little bit about the fact that policy issues, consumer protection, I mean, these things are manifesting themselves in ways that are not epic legislation, but they're regulation and rules and enforcement cases and inquiries and matters under investigation. So my example comes out of Dodd-Frank. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a brand new agency. It has an unprecedented breadth of mission. Any financial service product or service that touches the consumer is under their purview. So it could be a credit card, it could be an insurance policy, it could be any kind of investment product where individuals are solicited as customers or clients. And the breadth of this is such that it's all being done through the consumer lens and obviously wanting to protect the consumer. So we have clients who are in sort of adjunct businesses. They're not banks. They may originate mortgages. They may provide a service that's in the financial services arena, but they aren't separately regulated as banks. Well, they are getting calls and visits from the inspectors at this bureau to make certain that they are complying with things as intended. And so there's a regulatory cost that gets built in to businesses that weren't there just 5 or 10 years ago. We also have a pipeline that is still full of unwritten rules coming out of Dodd-Frank in 2010. So if I can size it, there were Sarbanes-Oxley was a 60-page law. Dodd-Frank was hundreds of pages with over 400 rules, less than half of which have been written, and those that have not been written are falling further and further behind the congressional deadline. So the notion that this is going to turn, that this is going to change, or we're about to enter a deregulatory phase, which could happen at some point, is completely premature, and I think the banks and others still see a lot coming their way. We had a couple of references to cybercrime. I want to go back to that, and I'm going to make this as straightforward as I can. Absolutely top of mind for boards, but in recent weeks, I'll say, there's been a bit of a shift. As you look at all the cases, starting with the retailers, Target, and you know, most recent with J.P. Morgan Chase, there's a couple things to keep in mind. I think most boards have reached the point quickly, you know, past the point that if we're secure enough, we're going to avoid the problem. I think that reality is, that ship has sailed, if you will. People realize that no matter how secure you are, you do have something at risk. The important thing is to remember, well, what's the driver of the business? If you're a retailer, you're trying to protect customer information, personally identifiable information. If you're a healthcare provider, same thing with, in the U.S., Social Security numbers and other private data. On the other hand, you may have a business that is more worried about, excuse me, corporate espionage or state-sponsored hacking that the Chinese have been accused of. A defense contractor, you know, programs and intellectual property that is otherwise not at this point ever, you know, meant to be public in any way, shape, or form. Well, that's a different risk, but it's still a huge risk for the board to tackle. So if we talk about secure, vigilant, and resilient, and just quickly in the cyberspace, secure is have we spent a sufficient amount to be as secure as we possibly can, you know, realizing that even that leaves some vulnerability. And secondly, do we know when we've had a breach or an attack? What's the mechanism that will tell us that? Well, it's not. I don't think it's the same, quite the same here in Canada, but in the States, 4 out of 10 times, the CEO of the company will learn because he gets a call or visit from the FBI or the National Security Agency and says, we have information that you've had a major breach. And because of the surveillance and the tools of the U.S. government, you know, in the banking world and beyond, that's a pretty big deal in that the government's telling you that you've got a problem before your own team might be able to see it or realize it. So that vigilance is supplemented by some government resources in that case. But the resiliency is where all the money is in my mind. In other words, what is our plan for dealing with a breach? And boards are really starting to shift their focus to what is the plan? Is it robust? Do we have lines of authority and responsibility predetermined? So at 10:30 on Tuesday morning when something happens, we pull that out and we can execute. If you've got to make dozens of decisions sort of when you're on the firing line, it's you know, you think about a military model, who's in charge? You need to know that ahead of time. And I think Eileen mentioned the notion of a tabletop exercise. That's simply a simulation where you're walking through, you know, in a case where it's not yet real, a potential breach, and do people react and respond the way they should? This is where getting some outside help, getting someone to critique your plan or help you build it is very, very important. And I'm not confused. This is not the board's job. This is management's responsibility. But it's a big deal, and I think it's now sort of settling into something you can deal with because we know how to do that. Do we have a good plan? Have we tested it? And is it going to be effective? And if we can take some questions on that. My last point, I guess, is the one it's an old friend of mine. In 1984, when I went to the SEC, that was the first time that what the SEC called financial fraud was sort of top of the list in terms of their enforcement activities. It was coming out of some some pretty bad cases that resulted from the 1980 and 81 recession in the U.S. And that was the case all the way through Enron and beyond until Madoff occurred. And the SEC shifted its focus to registered investment advisors because you remember that was a big deal in the States, and the SEC was roundly criticized for not having their eye on the ball and having all those losses in several Ponzi schemes, not the least of which was Madoff, of course. Well, now in July this year, they've decided that they're back in the business of looking at restatements, accounting gimmicks, and things that would rightfully bring an enforcement case. They're using a new approach with a financial fraud task force, a multidisciplinary task force within the SEC. And the reason I mention it is because from here forward, you're more likely to get a subpoena or a phone call or an inquiry opened. And, you know, the focus has been elsewhere. None of us missed those activities, although we enjoy them so much. I'm just saying that that is back, and I think you'll see into the fall and beyond, you're more likely to have to deal with an SEC investigation, which of course doesn't mean there's ultimately a case. But investigations are costly, and it's something that obviously audit committees and other committees have to deal with. Just a quick one, tax policy. You know, we're having trouble with growth in the States, but we have record cash balances on the balance sheets of our companies, much of which is trapped overseas because it's, quote, permanently reinvested and therefore not subject to U.S. tax at this time. They bring it back to make investments or grow the business, then they take a big haircut. Our tax policy is a nightmare right now. My point is we've got this weird situation where there's a lot of cash, there's a lack of confidence in making the investment, so we're sort of stuck in a very slow growth. And unless something changes with tax policy, I see that continuing for a long time.
So Bob, always instructive to look south of the border and see what's on the radar screen, because ultimately it finds its way across the border up into Canada. One of the things that struck me, and we have talked a lot about cyber, is just this concept of resiliency. So that's, to me, that's dealing with uncertainty. There's a number of things you just can't detect, won't come up, but it's how you respond. So that concept of having that in place is very important.